of the Woods of Gloom, the story of a vanished country farmer deep in the Cascade Mountains, where majestic trees towered overhead and forest trails were shrouded in dense fog, lay the tiny village of Woodsville. This place, lost among the forests, was known for its tranquility and slow pace of life. People here were rarely in a hurry, and even the most significant events passed without much excitement. But one autumn night dramatically changed this idyll, leaving behind a fog of mysticism and fear. Farmer Thomas Wilson was a respected member of the community. His farm was prosperous, and he himself was a man not only hardworking but with a character that many envied. He was known for his skill with machinery and a natural talent for the land. He could work for hours in the field without complaining about the hardships. But on that autumn night, as the wind whispered its ominous stories, Thomas went into the woods to get firewood, and that was the beginning of his disappearance. The forest around Woodsville was not only thick but also full of mystery. In ancient times, the locals believed that the spirits of the forest dwelled here, and that the mist that shrouded the trees at night was their cover. The forest was said to be a living thing capable of consuming and holding those who disturbed its peace. Thomas, however, was skeptical of these stories and did not believe in the supernatural. He had always assumed that the forest was just a forest and the fog was just fog. When Thomas left the house that evening, his wife, Mary, was as calm as usual. She knew he would be home before dark, as he always was. But as night covered the village with its black veil and the fog began to drift across the ground, Thomas did not return. At first, Mary thought he had been delayed by work, or perhaps he had met someone in the woods. But with each passing hour, her anxiety grew, and finally she decided it was time to act. Mary gathered some neighbors, and together they set off into the woods. The fog was so thick that it seemed alive, as if the forest itself was breathing. Every step was difficult, and sounds that had seemed normal before were now filled with fear. They called out for Thomas, but there were no answers. Soon their search led them to an old oak tree where they found his tools neatly stacked on the ground. The sight was strange, for the tools were not laid out as usual. They were lying in perfect order, as if someone had deliberately left them there. The tracks around the oak tree were strange and confusing, gradually disappearing into the mist. They looked as if someone had just walked down that path, but as the tracks went deeper into the forest, they became more and more blurred until they disappeared altogether. Much time was spent searching for Thomas, but he was never found. Since then, his disappearance has become part of local legend. The Forest of Darkness, as it began to be called, became the place everyone began to avoid. Mary, devastated by her loss, continued to live in the village for the rest of her life. But her life was filled with grief and sadness. She often told her version of events to the other villagers, claiming that when she went into the forest to look for her husband, she saw a flickering light among the trees and heard strange, barely discernible voices calling to her. The experience was so frightening and inexplicable that she was afraid to return to the forest, and always avoided it whenever she could. As the years passed, the story of Thomas and the Forest of Darkness became a local legend. At harvest festivals and other gatherings, the villagers would gather around the fire and tell of how the forest had swallowed Thomas and how it continued to hold its secrets. The village children were afraid to go into the forest. Even during the day, no one dared to seek answers to the mysteries it hid. However, everything changed when a group of young people from the city, fascinated by mysticism and extreme sports, decided to spend the night in the forest to find out what was really going on there. They were determined to prove that the legends of the Forest of Darkness were just fiction, and that it could all be explained rationally. These young adventurers, armed with cameras, torches, and special equipment, arrived in the forest in the early evening. Their original plan was simple: to spend the night outdoors and document all the unusual phenomena. They set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by old trees and began their investigation. It started out quite normally. They recorded the sounds of the forest, making comments about how the forest looked in the dark. But soon strange things began to happen. Their torches began to flicker and their cameras recorded strange movements in the dark that they couldn't explain. Noise that had seemed normal before now seemed somehow sinister and unnatural. One of the participants, named Jack, spotted an old trail deeper into the woods. and suggested following it despite the protests of the others. Jack went in the woods alone, leaving his friends at camp. He was determined to solve the mystery of the forest. The trail seemed ordinary at first, but it soon became more winding and dangerous. The fog around it grew thicker, and soon Jack discovered strange symbols carved into the trees that he couldn't explain. These symbols looked like ancient runes that he had once seen in mythology books, but he didn't know what they were doing in this forest. As Jack tried to photograph the symbols, he heard a strange, barely perceptible rustle. At first he thought it was just animals, but the sound became more and more distinct and seemed as if someone or something was following him. He quickened his steps, and soon found that the trail ended at an old abandoned hut that seemed uninhabited for years. He entered the hut, and immediately felt the icy cold that filled its interior. The inside of the hut was full of dust and cobwebs, with old, rusted furniture lying in the corner. In the center of the room, he noticed a large book with the same symbols on the cover as the trees. Jack opened the book and saw that it was full of notes and drawings describing rituals and ceremonies associated with the ancient spirits of the forest. With each new look, his fear grew, and he felt that he was on the verge of something irreversible. Among the pages, he found notes about how the forest can consume people who disturb its peace, and how these people become part of the forest when their spirits contact ancient forces. The book also stated that, to get rid of the curse, a sacrifice must be made and a special ritual must be performed to appease the spirits. Jack, in a panic, tried to leave the cabin, but noticed that the doors and windows were locked. He heard the rustles again, which grew louder and louder, and saw shadows dancing in the corners of the room. He tried to get out, but the fog seemed to weigh down his every step. Soon his friends began to panic when Jack didn't return. They went looking for him and came across the same path he had followed, but found that it too had changed. The path seemed endless and intertwined with other paths that disappeared into the mist. They searched for Jack until dawn, but they never found him. Cameras left at the camp showed only flickering lights and strange shadows that could not be explained. When the police and rescue workers conducted an official search, they also found no trace of Jack. They sealed the cabin and did everything they could to prevent further exploration of the forest. But rumors and legends continued to spread, and soon Woodsville became known as the village surrounded by the cursed forest. As the years passed, the Forest of Darkness became a topic of discussion among paranormal investigators. Some claimed to have seen ghosts in the woods. Others said they felt the presence of unknown forces as they passed by, but no one dared to enter its depths for fear of repeating the fate of Thomas and Jack. Miss Mary, who had lost her husband, continued to live in the village but never went near the forest again. She spent the rest of her life alone, telling her grandchildren that one day her husband and his spirit would return from the forest to find her. Though many thought her stories were just the ramblings of an old woman, others believed there was a grain of truth in her words. Now the Forest of Darkness continues to stand in the shadows, hiding its secrets and waiting for new daredevils to venture into its depths. But anyone who knows the history of the forest realizes that some secrets are best left unsolved, and some places are best avoided lest they become part of their dark legacy. Increasingly, village old-timers claim that the sounds of saws and axes can be heard in the woods at night, as if Thomas is still working on his trees. And those brave enough to listen hear not only sounds, but ominous whispers that are said to be calling their names. Those who succumb to this call are said to disappear without a trace, just as Thomas did years ago. So if you ever find yourself in Woodsville, remember this story and avoid the Forest of Darkness. For it is not just a forest, but something more, and something that lives and breathes, and that does not forgive those who disturb its peace. It's the haunting of Hollow Hill Farm. Hollow Hill Farm lay nestled deep within the fog-shrouded hills of rural Pennsylvania, a place so remote and forgotten that even the most seasoned travelers often overlooked it. On the farm, abandoned for nearly a century, was a desolate patch of land overrun by brambles and thorny underbrush, its once proud fields now reclaimed by the wild. The farmhouse, once the heart of a thriving homestead, was a crumbling relic of its former self, sagging under the weight of time and the relentless encroachment of nature. For decades, the farm had been the subject of hushed whispers and fearful glances, its name uttered only in the safety of daylight. The stories that surrounded Hollow Hill were as thick as the fog that often blanketed the area. Tales of eerie lights flickering in the windows of the abandoned farmhouse, of ghostly figures seen wandering the fields at dusk, and of a darkness that seemed to permeate the very soil. The most chilling of these tales was that of the Holloway family, the original owners of the farm, who had met a tragic and mysterious end. The Holloways had arrived in Pennsylvania in the early 1800s, a family of pioneers eager to carve out a new life in the untamed wilderness. They were hardworking and determined, building their farm from the ground up, clearing the land, and planting crops that would sustain them through the harsh winters. For a time, the farm flourished and the Holloways became well-respected members of the small community that had begun to form in the area. But as the years passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the livestock. The Holloways' cattle, sheep, and chickens began to disappear, one by one vanishing without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the pens, nothing to indicate what had happened to the animals. The family searched the surrounding woods and fields, but their efforts were in vain. The animals were simply gone. Then the crops began to fail. What had once been fertile, bountiful fields became barren and lifeless. No matter how much the Holloways tilled the soil, watered the plants, or prayed for rain, the crops withered and died. The family's fortune, once so promising, began to crumble. Desperation set in as their food stores dwindled and the winter loomed on the horizon. It was around this time that the rumors began. Neighbors spoke of seeing strange figures on the Holloway property late at night, shadowy forms that seemed to materialize out of the darkness and vanish just as quickly. Others claimed to have heard unsettling noises, low guttural growls, and the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the farm. The once friendly community began to distance itself from the Holloways, avoiding them in town and refusing to visit the farm. The final straw came in the winter of 1857. The Holloway family, father, mother, and 3 young children, were found dead in their farmhouse. The discovery was made by a neighbor who had grown concerned after not seeing any of the family for several days. When he arrived at the farm, he found the front door ajar, the interior of the house cold and silent. Inside, he discovered the bodies of the Holloways, each one twisted in an unnatural position, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. The cause of death was never determined, though the coroner's report noted the absence of any visible injuries or signs of a struggle. The local authorities were baffled, and the incident was quickly hushed up, the farm abandoned to the elements. As the years turned to decades, the story of the Holloways became a local legend, a ghost story told to frighten children and warn off curious trespassers. The farm, now known as Hollow Hill, was left to decay, its fields overrun by wild growth, and its once sturdy buildings collapsing into ruins. But the tales of strange occurrences continued. Hunters who ventured too close to the property reported hearing disembodied voices, footsteps in the underbrush, and the eerie feeling of being watched. Others claimed to have seen ghostly figures in the farmhouse windows or wandering the fields at night. But the most terrifying of these accounts was the legend of the Shadow Man. The Shadow Man was a figure of pure darkness, a tall, faceless silhouette that seemed to absorb the very light around it. He was said to appear without warning, emerging from the shadows of the farmhouse or the thick fog that often settled over the fields. Those who encountered the Shadow Man described a feeling of overwhelming dread, as if the very air around them had turned cold and heavy. Some claimed that the figure spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, a sound that sent shivers down the spine and filled the mind with terror. Others said that the Shadow Man did not speak at all, but merely stared, his featureless face a void that seemed to draw them in. The stories of the Shadow Man varied, but all agreed on one thing. Those who saw him were never the same. Some were driven to madness, their minds unraveling in the days and weeks after their encounter. Others became reclusive, refusing to speak of what they had seen, their eyes haunted by the memory. And then there were those who disappeared entirely, vanishing without a trace, as if they had been swallowed by the darkness of Hollow Hill. In the late 1990s, after years of neglect, the property was put up for sale. Most locals wouldn't dare buy it, but Jack and Emily Thompson, a young couple from the city, saw the farm as an opportunity to escape the noise and chaos of urban life. They were drawn to the idea of restoring the old farmhouse, of breathing new life into the land. The price was right and the history, though unsettling, didn't deter them. They dismissed the stories as mere folklore, the kind of exaggerated tales that small towns often clung to. When they first arrived at Hollow Hill, the Thompsons were struck by the beauty of the place. The rolling hills, the dense woods, and the clear, open skies seemed a world away from the city. The farmhouse, though in need of significant repairs, still held a certain charm, its weathered wood and stone walls speaking of a time long past. They were eager to begin work, to turn the dilapidated building into their dream home. But from the moment they set foot on the property, things began to go wrong. At first, it was small things. Tools that would go missing only to reappear in strange places, doors that would swing open or shut on their own, and the dog, Max, who refused to enter the house, growling and barking at something only he could see. Jack and Emily laughed it off, attributing the odd occurrences to the quirks of an old house and the nervousness of moving to a new place. But as the days turned into weeks, the strange happenings escalated. At night, they heard noises, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the sound of footsteps in the attic, and the distant, mournful cries of what sounded like a child. Emily began to have vivid nightmares, dreams in which she saw the Holloway family, their ghostly forms pale and translucent, their eyes hollow and dark. In her dreams, they would reach out to her, their mouths moving as if trying to speak, but no sound would come out. She would wake each night drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. Act 2 began to feel the effects of the farm's dark presence. He became irritable and withdrawn, spending long hours working on the house, as if trying to drown out the unease that gnawed at him. He stopped sleeping, plagued by a feeling of dread that he couldn't shake, a sense that something was watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Emily decided to dig deeper into the history of Hollow Hill. She had grown tired of the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched, and she hoped that understanding the farm's past might bring her some peace. She drove to the local library, where she spent hours combing through old newspapers, land records, and town archives. What she discovered was more horrifying than she could have imagined. The Holloways had not simply died. They had been victims of something far darker. According to the old records, the family had made a pact with an ancient entity, a being that promised to save their farm from ruin in exchange for a blood sacrifice. The Holloways, desperate and starving, had agreed, not fully understanding the price they would have to pay. The entity known only as the Shadow Man had granted them one final harvest, but at the cost of their lives and the souls of their children. The more Emily read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The strange occurrences, the nightmares, the overwhelming sense of dread, all of it pointed to the presence of this malevolent entity, still lingering on the farm, still hungry for the fear and suffering of those who lived there. She felt a cold chill run down her spine as she realized that the Shadow Man had not been banished with the deaths of the Holloways. He was still there, waiting, watching. Emily raced home, her mind reeling with the horrors she had uncovered. She burst through the door, calling for Jack, but the house was eerily silent. A cold wind swept through the hallway, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Panic gripped her as she searched the house, calling his name over and over. Finally, she found him in the barn, standing in the center of the room, his back to her. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. As she approached, she realized something was terribly wrong. Jack stood unnaturally still, his head tilted at an odd angle, eyes wide with terror. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw the dark figure standing just behind him. Tall, faceless, cloaked in shadow, the Shadow Man. Before she could scream, the figure lunged, and the world went black. When Emily awoke, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the barn, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She struggled to her feet, her head spinning, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack was nowhere to be seen. The barn was empty, save for the rusted tools and the rotten remains of old hay bales. But the sense of dread of being watched was stronger than ever. She stumbled out of the barn, her legs trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The farmhouse loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless, the walls seeming to close in around her as she approached. She knew she had to find Jack to get him out of there, but every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave and never look back. But she couldn't leave him. Not like this. With a trembling hand, she pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was cold, the air thick with the smell of mold and rot. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. Emily moved through the house, her heart pounding in her chest, calling out Jack's name, her voice barely more than a whisper. She found him in the bedroom, lying on the floor, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. For a moment she thought he was dead, but then she saw the rise and fall of his chest, the faint, shallow breaths. She rushed to his side, shaking him, trying to rouse him, but he didn't respond. His skin was cold to the touch, his face pale and gaunt, as if he had aged years in just a few hours. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to lift him, to get him out of the house, but he was too heavy, his body limp and unresponsive. She screamed for help, her voice echoing through the empty house, but there was no one to hear her. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then she felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, watching her from the corner of the room. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, and saw him. The Shadow Man. He stood in the doorway, his form a void of darkness, featureless and terrifying. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure took a step forward, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She backed away, dragging Jack's lifeless body with her, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, the shadows twisting and writhing as the Shadow Man approached. Emily's vision blurred, her mind screaming for her to run, to escape. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her body paralyzed with fear as the figure loomed over her. And then, just as the darkness seemed ready to swallow her whole, the world went black. The next morning, a neighbor passing by noticed that the Thompsons' truck was still parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of life at the farm. Concerned, he approached the house and knocked on the door. When no one answered, he entered cautiously, calling out for Jack and Emily. He found them in the barn, lying side by side on the cold, hard floor. Their faces were twisted in expressions of sheer terror, and their eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The neighbor backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, and fled to get help. The police arrived within the hour, but there was little they could do. The cause of death was never determined. The whispers of the curse of Hollow Hill Farm spread like wildfire through the town. The farm was once again abandoned, left to the ghosts and shadows that roamed its cursed grounds. To this day, Hollow Hill Farm stands as a dark reminder of the past, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thin, where shadows hold secrets, and where the land itself is cursed. Few dare to go near it, and those who do seldom speak of what they see. The farm remains, waiting, hungry for the next soul brave, or foolish enough to enter its haunted grounds. It's the enigma of Thornfield Farm. In the heart of the rolling countryside, nestled among ancient hills and dense forests, lay Thornfield Farm. This sprawling estate had been in the Harper family for generations, its weathered barns and ivy-clad cottages bearing witness to a long history of farming and folklore. Recently, however, Thornfield had become more than just a quaint rural retreat. It had transformed into a place of deep-seated mystery and intrigue. The story began one crisp autumn evening, as Sarah Harper returned to the farm after years away. She had come back to settle the affairs of her late grandfather, old Mr. Harper, who had passed away under circumstances that left many unanswered questions. Sarah, a historian by profession, had always been skeptical of her grandfather's tales of the supernatural, but the eerie atmosphere of Thornfield made her reconsider. On her first night back, the silence of the farm was broken by soft, deliberate knocks. At first, Sarah thought it was merely the wind or an old pipe settling, but the knocks grew more rhythmic and insistent. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, she decided to investigate. Stepping out into the foggy night, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. The mist curled around the barn like a living entity, and the distant howl of a fox only added to the sense of foreboding. Approaching the barn, Sarah noticed the wooden doors were ajar, though they had been firmly closed earlier. The knocks ceased as she reached the entrance. Inside, the barn was dimly lit by the pale moonlight filtering through the gaps in the wall. Sarah's flashlight revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Stacks of hay, old tools, and cobwebs. She returned to the house with a growing sense of unease, convinced that the barn held secrets she was yet to uncover. The following morning, as Sarah was sorting through her grandfather's belongings, she stumbled upon an old, hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of his study. Inside, she found a weathered diary bound in cracked leather. The diary belonged to Eleanor Harper, her great-grandmother, who had lived on Thornfield Farm during the early 1900s. The entries were a tapestry of unsettling events. Strange noises, unexplained disappearances of livestock, and eerie sightings of figures in the fields. One entry, dated October 14, 1912, stood out. Last night, beneath the full moon's light, I saw a figure cloaked in shadows wandering through the orchard. I followed, my heart pounding, but it vanished near the old oak tree. The wind carried whispers, but I saw no one. Determined to unravel the mystery, Sarah ventured to the orchard mentioned in the diary. The ancient apple trees loomed above her, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet. As she approached the old oak tree, she noticed its bark was etched with strange symbols. Sarah felt a chill as the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. Underneath the tree's roots, she unearthed a small, weathered box. Inside were old photographs and a locket with a faded portrait of a woman. The locket was inscribed with the words, "To my dearest, forever in my heart." Sarah was puzzled. Who was this woman, and why had her great-grandmother kept such a personal item hidden? That night, Sarah again heard the mysterious knocks. Driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension, she followed the sound to the barn. This time, she noticed something peculiar. Ancient symbols carved into the wooden walls, forming an intricate pattern. As she traced the symbols, a sudden chill swept through the barn, and the shadows seemed to dance and shift. The whispers grew louder, a disembodied voice calling her name. The air thickened with an ethereal mist. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The voice was faint but distinct, a mournful tone that seemed to beckon her. Sarah felt a presence beside her, a comforting warmth amidst the cold. She knew she had to follow the trail laid out by the symbols. The next day, she deciphered the pattern and found it resembled a map. It led her to a secluded part of the forest on the farm's property. The forest was dense and overgrown, the trees whispering secrets of their own. Sarah pushed through the underbrush until she reached an old, forgotten cemetery, its gravestones barely legible and overrun with ivy. Among the weathered stones was one that stood out. An aged gravestone with the name Eleanor Harper etched upon it. Sarah's heart raced as she realized this was her great-grandmother's final resting place. The cemetery felt oddly serene, and the whispers from the barn seemed to converge here, as if the spirits were at peace. Next to the grave, Sarah found a small, ornate box buried beneath the soil. Inside were old coins, intricate jewelry, and a bundle of documents. One document was a letter from Eleanor, explaining that the treasure was meant to be discovered by a descendant who would restore harmony to the Harper legacy. The letter detailed family disputes and the promise made to protect the treasure until the right person came along. With the discovery of the hidden treasure, the strange occurrences at Thornfield began to wane. The rhythmic knocks and eerie whispers ceased, and the farm's atmosphere grew lighter. Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment and closure. She decided to stay on Thornfield Farm, determined to honor her great-grandmother's legacy by restoring the farm and ensuring that its rich history was preserved. As the seasons changed and Thornfield began to flourish again, Sarah often thought of the mysterious events that had unfolded. The farm remained a place of quiet mystery, a reminder of the past that was intricately woven into the present. The enigma of Thornfield Farm was no longer a source of fear, but a testament to the enduring connection between the past and the present, and the unseen threads that bind them together.